everyone, this is Pranjal, and today I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Elyn Saks, a distinguished professor of law, professor of psychology and psychiatry and the behavioral sciences at the USC Gold School of Law, and the director of the Saks Institute for Mental Health, Law, Policy, and Ethics. She has published over 50 articles and book chapters and has written 5 books, including the award-winning memoir, The Center Cannot Hold, My Journey Through Madness, which describes her journey with schizophrenia. And I'm super excited to speak with her today and discuss schizophrenia. And is there anything you'd like to add, Elyn, to that?
No, thank you for that kind introduction.
So my first question for you is, can you tell me a little bit about your journey with schizophrenia, including when and how you were diagnosed?
Sure. I went to college at Vanderbilt, and then I went to Oxford. I was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford University. And at Oxford, I broke down. It started out looking like depression with mild paranoid psychotic features, which is how schizophrenia often begins. But it developed into a florid psychosis, a pure schizophrenic breakdown. A friend of mine who's a neurologist said that it seemed like I was having a lot of difficulties and I should go see a psychiatrist. And I was kind of resistant at first, but then I thought, Richard, the neurologist, is a good guy. He's really smart and he really cares about me. If he thinks I should do this, I should try. So I went to see a psychoanalyst. I'll call her Mrs. Jones, who I saw 5 days a week in Oxford for the 3 years that I was there, 5 years I was there, whatever it was. It's sort of interesting. When I had my breakdown at Yale, they had a policy that you had to see the head of University of Psychiatry to determine if you're well enough to go back to school after a leave of absence. And like any good student, I looked this guy up. And this is before the internet, so I was looking in periodical indices and flipping through books and journals, and I find an article by this guy. Students withdrawn from school for psychiatric reasons, evaluating them for readmission, questions you want to ask and answers you want to hear. So when I went to the interview, I was really well prepared, and he did readmit me. And I went back to law school. I finished in the usual 3 years. I then knew I didn't want to be a corporate lawyer. I thought I wanted to be a legal aid lawyer, but I really hated the work. It was very boring and very stressful at the same time, so I decided to go into teaching. And at first I taught at a minor law school, legal writing, which is the lowest of the low on the totem pole. But then I went on the market nationally and ended up going to USC Law School, which has been really great for me.
And how has living with schizophrenia shaped your career as a law professor?
I use my illness all the time. My area is mental health law. So I study things like civil and criminal issues involved with schizophrenia. So civil issues would include things like civil commitment, right to treatment, right to refuse treatment, confidentiality, Americans with Disabilities Act, and criminal would be things like the insanity defense, competency to stand trial, and competency to be executed. You actually have to be competent to be executed. It's kind of an interesting notion. But those are the things that I am interested in and studying. As I said, I'm a mental health law professor. I supervise students in studies on supported decision-making and psychiatric advance directives. Wrote my memoir, Center Cannot Hold, and I'm working on a sequel to the memoir right now. So that's being interesting and fun.
And when you're talking about mental health law, what kind of changes do you think the U.S. needs to do in terms of laws surrounding schizophrenia?
Well, I think that the main thing we need to do is offer more people care, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the way to get more people care, there are 2 possibilities. You force it or you encourage it. To me, the latter is much smarter. If you use force, the person has no incentive not to go back to where they were once the force stops being administered. But if you recruit someone into their treatment, it's going to make it a much more sustainable, practice going forward. So we should study ways that we can help people see that they need and want treatment rather than applying force. That's one of the key messages of my own work, that forced care is problematic care. That's something that I really think needs to be changed. But the other thing is, if we're going to help people through treatment, we have to be able to provide the treatment. And a lot of times you can't. I did a study on high-functioning schizophrenia with a famous psychosis expert, Dr. Stephen Martyr, and a couple of other people, Shirley Glynn and others, and I. And it's been published on techniques that, quote, high-functioning schizophrenic people use to manage their symptoms. And one day I asked Steve, what percentage of people with schizophrenia were high-functioning in our sense, were, professional, managerial, technical, full-time students, full-time caregivers. He said, I don't know, Ellen. The real question is how many could be if we provided proper resources. And I thought he was exactly right. That's what we need to do, is provide resources. So that's one of the things I try to write about and advocate for. This is just so important. Obviously, stigma is incredibly important too, because the worst thing about it is it deters people from getting care. And sometimes people need care and will do much better with it. So it's a shame if they resist it because of stigma.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When you talk about providing people with more resources, what kind of resources do you think are the most important?
Well, there are lots of things that are outside the bailiwick or purview of the mental health system that we need, like, good housing, and good access to physical health care, and, access to decent education and those kinds of things. But in the mental health sector, the way to provide it is to give people access to care, to, have sites they can go to where they can get treatment. There are some interesting new programs involved with care, which are kind of peer-led programs. I'm doing it with some folks from something called Include, Judith Klein and her partner, Ben Carey, who used to be the Science Times writer in New York. And what we did was we invited people to get in touch with us if they wanted or needed or were concerned about or thinking about treatment. And we would connect them with peers for two reasons. Nobody knows what it feels like to have something like schizophrenia better than someone else who has it. And if both people are in the same place or space, so to speak, there's less stigma. So people were connected with peers who connected them, who knew the law, who were educated and trained about the law and knew about resources, and connected people to resources. And Ben and Judith wanted to study how often people actually took advantage of those referrals. But I thought we should also study downstream effects on quality of life, like more independent living and working. So maybe we'll add that as a component to our work. But it is kind of interesting that these new products are coming on board.
Yeah, that sounds really promising to me. I mean, I can speak from my own experiences with OCD. I, by chance, was put in a suite in college with another girl who also has OCD, and it's been really helpful to have a peer who understands. And I can imagine that especially if you're trying to navigate treatment for the first time, it can be really helpful to have someone who's doing it with you. So,
yeah.
Do you know yet how effective that program is, or are you guys still in the process of collecting the data?
We're still in the process of collecting the data. I mean, there are two things I do on campus, which I think or I hope are helpful. One is I'm the faculty advisor to something called Law Students for Better Health. And these students have lots of issues, mostly mental health, but also cancer and Crohn's and ulcerative colitis and things like that. And we meet once a month, and I sometimes give talks and sometimes just have lunch with them. And then there's a NAMI program, which is National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is usually a parent group, a family group, but this is a student group, people who have lived experience themselves. And it's campus-wide, and I also am faculty advisor for them and try to meet with them once a month and give talks and things like that. So I kind of try to open people's eyes and give back. There's something called Fountain House as well, which is, it started out in New York, and it's a peer group where people go and hang out with other peers, and there are counselors there if they want to speak to them. If not, they don't have to. And I think it's just come to the LA campus as well. It's going to other places around the country, which I think is really cool. Oh, how cool.
Yeah.
That's so nice.
And I just realized before we keep going, some people listening might not know what schizophrenia is. So could you give a easy to understand explanation for people who know nothing about it?
Sure. It's called a thought disorder or a psychotic disorder. And the primary symptoms are things like delusions, like people are following me. I have the delusion sometimes that I've killed hundreds of thousands of people with my thoughts. Hallucinations, I had a picture of a man standing with a raised knife above my head, and disorganized or incoherent speech. So I had a breakdown on the roof of the Yale Law School, and I said to my classmates, "Are you having the same experience I am of boards jumping around the pages of the cases? We've got a case to join." I don't believe in joints, but they do hold your body together. So words that are like loosely connected but put together really make no sense. Those are the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, things you have and don't want. Negative symptoms are things you're lacking and wish you had, like apathy, inability to work, inability to make relationships, that kind of thing. The positive symptoms we have pretty good treatments for, good medication, good therapy. The negative symptoms, not so much. So a lot of the personal and societal burden of schizophrenia resides in these negative symptoms. And for me, except the first 2 years I was ill, I've been blessed to avoid the negative symptoms. And I think it's probably because I have such a tight connection with my treaters. So being able to develop a relationship with them kind of spilled over into being able to develop relationships with other people and so forth. But that's been, a big blessing. And I sometimes feel survivor guilt. I see my analyst 4 days a week and my pharmacologist once or twice a week. And, a lot of people can't afford to do that. But then I think, I'm really lucky. It's really helpful to me. I have the resources to do it. And it doesn't hurt other people, so why not? So I'm sort of reconciled to not feeling that guilty about it and just, taking advantage of it and being able to use it to, do something productive or good or positive in my life.
Yeah, I think you getting treatment actually makes it much better for other people because your work is aimed at helping people with schizophrenia and other mental health issues. And then B, it also goes to show that these things do work because there's a lot of people out there who think medication doesn't help, therapy doesn't help. Oh, if you have schizophrenia, there's nothing that can be done, you're doomed.
Right.
But this shows that if we do make these things more accessible to everyone, then more people would be able to have fulfilling lives.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You put it beautifully.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And what's the cause of schizophrenia? What's happening biologically or environmentally?
It probably has both biological and environmental components. Certainly biologically, there are changes in the brain with dopamine and other sort of neurotransmitters, and they're just studying those things now and trying to identify, what exactly is going on and what can we do about it. But psychologically too, stress is bad for any illness and in particular for mental illness. And if you're having a lot of challenges in your life, that's going to make it harder to navigate and do well. So people need help with those kinds of things too.
And I've heard that a lot of people, either like they get diagnosed with schizophrenia or it tends to get much worse when they first like start college or like in that age, like early 20s, late teens. And I was wondering what's the reason for that, if we know.
Well, there are two possibilities people think. One, that's just the age where it happens, just like, cancer tends to happen in your 60s or whatever, if you're lucky. So that's just, biologically, that's the tipping point. The other thing is like leaving home for the first time and having so many things to do, your schoolwork, your laundry, your food, your relationships. It's just, a huge amount of stress and very overwhelming. And I think people need help. I mean, it used to be thought that medication was sufficient to treat schizophrenia. It's now thought that a combination of medication and, quote, psychosocial treatment is really the treatment of choice. You need to do both. And I think that's true. Certainly that's been the case for me.
Yeah, I think that's true too. Just from the other people I spoke to, it seems like everyone needs the psychotherapy. For some people, they need the psychotherapy and medication.
Yeah.
Some people just need psychotherapy, but it seems like just medication usually isn't enough for most people.
I would think that.
And is there anything that can be done to prevent schizophrenia?
I don't think so. So basically, you've got something called prodromal symptoms, which is symptoms before the full outbreak of the illness, leading up to it. And one thought is, the length of untreated psychosis correlates with recovery rates. The longer you wait, the less recovery. So why not, when people show prodromal symptoms, why not act immediately then? The trouble is, half the people who show prodromal symptoms go on to develop psychosis, and the other half don't. So if you medicate everybody, you're medicating half people who would never need it, which doesn't seem right or feasible. So the alternative, which people recommend, and I'm not sure how much it's done, is to offer good and extensive and robust psychosocial treatment to both groups. So that's one thing that we can do to kind of try to interrupt the malignant course of this possible malignant course of this disease by catching it early.
And what are the prodromal symptoms?
Someone may be getting a little bit suspicious without having frank delusions. They may show some negative symptoms like, withdrawing from friendships and stuff like that, having a difficult time getting their schoolwork done and, things like that. So before you have a frank delusion, you have indications of, not doing that well. Like, again, suspiciousness, it doesn't rise to delusions, but it's suspiciousness which can turn into delusions and, difficulty with friendships and working and things like that.
Yeah, I see what you mean though, because a lot of people experience that and don't have schizophrenia. Right. They might have something else, and you don't want to treat them for the wrong thing. So I wanted to ask, what advice would you give to someone who's been newly diagnosed, and what advice would you give to their family and their loved ones and people who are trying to support them?
I think someone who's been newly diagnosed, I would recommend educating yourself about the illness, what it looks like, how it unfolds, so you can kind of stay on top of it. And also, recognize that it's not a sentence to a bleak and painful life. You can still have a good and happy and productive life, even if you have schizophrenia. So that's really important. And families should be supportive. I don't think families should challenge. No, that's a delusion. That's crazy to think that. But be more, gosh, I hear that you're really scared. What can I do to help? That kind of thing. I think that's usually more useful than being confrontational. Also, peers are really important. So I think going to a support group for people with mental health disorders can be extremely empowering. I mean, I know for example, I've also had cancer, and I go to a support group and I see people with much more difficult and serious illnesses than mine, living life with dignity and well-being, and it's kind of inspirational, kind of encourages you to do that yourself. And again, peers understand better than anybody, and there's less stigma. And there are some peer groups. I know there's certainly a group for bipolar people. I think it's called Bipolar Support Community or something like that, but there may be for schizophrenia as well. So I would suggest that. And with families, again, don't confront, don't argue, don't challenge, but, kind of try to suggest that you get emotionally where the person is, and you're asking what you can do to help would be the best thing. A lot of people say, there's something called anosognosia, which is lack of insight into your illness. And like 50% of people with schizophrenia have that. Some people say, well, that's a good reason to force them to have treatment if they don't understand they need it. And I always say, what you can say to people is there are all sorts of difficult and interesting philosophical issues around mental illness, how you distinguish it from neurodiversity or diversity in general or just plain eccentricity. And that's for everybody to decide, him or herself. But you can also say, even if you don't have this illness, these medications help with things you've been complaining of, like difficulty sleeping or jitteriness or whatever. Why not give it a try? So that's something you can try. I don't know how successful it will be, but it's worth trying.
And what about side effects of the medication? Are there any side effects that people should be cautious?
I mean, there are side effects. The drug I'm on, clozapine, the main drug I'm on, clozapine, it's a Cadillac in terms of efficacy, but it has risks of white blood count going haywire. So the first 6 months you have to have a weekly blood test, and the next 6 months every other week, and then once a month the rest of your life. But it's an amazing drug. It's, I don't have no symptoms, but I have many fewer symptoms than I would. As my husband says, psychosis is not like an on-off switch, but a dimmer. At the far end, I'll have a crazy thought and recognize it immediately. And going through the spectrum, I have more and more belief in what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and it's amazing that we have these medications. I mean, sometimes I think how different my life would be if I was born 50 years earlier and didn't have the medications that I use. Absolutely. And I know we're very lucky to be born in today's day and age. But it's also interesting because I feel like just inventing the medication is only half the issue. Then the other half the issue is making it accessible to people and, educating people, telling them how they can get it. Making it so that it's affordable. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And with schizophrenia, obviously and in general, I think with any kind of medication for mental health problems, there's such a stigma of you don't need this, just be stronger.
Right.
But thankfully, I think that's decreasing over time.
Yeah. I don't know if I told you of my students that they all write an essay to be part of my institute. Mm-hmm. And over the last 10 years, the first 9 years, I would say, 40% self-disclosed in their application that they had mental illness in themselves or loved ones. But when we got together as a group, only one person only 10% self-disclosed, which is kind of stunning because law students are all about dignity and liberty and rights and so on. But they, I guess they just didn't feel safe saying it. But this past year, 80% self-disclosed, including one woman who said, I've never before said this outside my family. I have bipolar illness with psychotic features and I take medication. And I thought that was really brave. And it's not a study, it's completely anecdotal, but it's kind of suggestive that things are getting a little bit better. Ironically, I think COVID helped with that because more people, unfortunately, develop depression and anxiety, but it also gave them more empathy to people who have those things because of their illness and not because of, COVID. to help them be more sympathetic and empathetic. And also, a lot of people said, well, you can't do therapy over the internet. It just won't work. Well, it turns out you can. It may not be as good, but for people who are geographically remote or don't have transportation, it can be the best they can do. And that's a good thing to be able to offer, in my opinion.
Yeah, most of the therapy I've done has been remote, and it's pretty good. It's really convenient. And obviously it's not the best for everyone, but we should always have as many options as possible and let people make that choice for themselves.
That's totally right. I completely agree with that. Yeah. As many options as possible.
Yeah,
Thanks so much for doing this. Just really kind and generous, and I hope helpful to people.
Yeah, I hope so too. And this was so helpful to me. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with me today, Dr. Saks. And thank you to everyone listening for taking the time out of their day to listen to this episode of Not Another Depressed Teen. As always, feel free to DM us on Instagram, send us an email, or visit our website, notanotherdepressedteen.com, with any questions, suggestions, or feedback. I hope all of you have a great day.